and welcome to Purposeful Empathy, a show dedicated to conversations with people who want to grow and spread empathy throughout the world.
Welcome to an episode of Purposeful Empathy. I'm joined today by Rasha Kutty, who is the founder and chief facilitator at the Empathy University. I love it, which is an organization that provides a one-stop solution for empathy education through certification programs, customized experiential workshops, and consulting projects. She is a certified instructional designer on her way to becoming a certified empathic intervision facilitator. We'll have to ask what that's about. And prior to this empathy work, she was deeply involved in the corporate sector with organizations including Yahoo, Apple, Pearson, and McGraw-Hill. She's actively involved in social causes and has collaborated with some of the big and best educational pioneers in the world, including TEDx and Technovation. So thank you so much for being with me today, Rasha.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor.
Well, great. I know you're in Kerala right now, and
yes,
it's evening time for you. So thank you for finding the energy to do an interview late in the evening. Could you start by telling us about the backstory of the Empathy University? I'm so keen to hear about this.
All right. So I started the Empathy University in around 2016, and it came about because of this sudden realization. You know, after a point, I realized that I've been through so many years when it comes to schooling, through the education system. And when I was going through one of the most difficult phases in life, that's when I kind of realized, all this nearly 20 years of school, college, and I still am not capable, or I'm just not, well equipped enough to face some of the obstacles when they hit me, right, in life. And so where did things go wrong? And I realized that, something is missing in the education system. And it was this thought that kind of, gave me the whole idea. And then around the same time, I also happened to read the book To Kill a Mockingbird. And there's a very beautiful, quote over there in the book that says something like, you can never really understand a person unless you you climb into his skin and walk around in it. And it really, it touched me. And for some reason, that kind of brought about a change. I began to, brainstorm on ideas, and that's how the Empathy University came into being. At that time, I was working at Yahoo, and I quit my job, and then since then I've been doing this. Now and then I take up consultation projects, but otherwise it's been more or less spreading empathy in the world.
So it really comes from a personal narrative of your own lived experience, and then you launched into entrepreneurship, even though that meant leaving a status kind of job with the tech industry. So tell us, what does the Empathy University do? What does it offer? What are some of the initiatives that are happening under your leadership?
All right. So we started off providing a lot of workshops, and it was mainly focused on teacher training. And then we used to provide workshops for students, senior students, and even the corporate industry was a focus. So it started out this way. Again, like I said, it all began because, I felt there was a change that needed to be brought in the education industry. So teacher training was a huge focus. In fact, educators themselves. So we provide workshops. Because of COVID, there has been a huge shift in its webinars these days. I do a lot of webinars. And I also do consulting. Basically, companies sometimes ask, what is the best way to build a culture, that has empathy. So recently a startup got in touch asking how right from recruitment to all the HR practices, how do you embed empathy into it? And so these are some of the consultation projects that I take up. We are also planning to launch a certification program. It's called the Empathic Efficiency Certification Program, and that hopefully will start off in December. So that's a program where it's a 3-month course, and every 2 weeks we join in for a live half-day session. And there's also study material. There's also a lot of homework that needs to be done. And it's a 3-month course where a lot of concepts like starts off with self-empathy, and then empathy. How do you inculcate that into your personal life when it comes to even parenting and relationships? And then goes on to how to practice empathy in the professional space. And at the end, even adversarial empathy, right? People who have really hurt you, or, you know, people you don't really like, how do you practice empathy to that level? So it's a 3-month course. So these are some of the things that the Empathy University is currently doing. Yeah.
So people, let's say teachers, right? You're working with elementary school, primary and secondary school teachers. They would come, you know, into a course, and you have, let's say, a curriculum over a period of number of weeks. Could you give me an idea of what a lesson would look like or sound like with a set of teachers?
Sure. It's very experiential, and every concept that we discuss, including empathy, I usually try to keep it less of theory and a lot of, you know, practice, in the sense teachers, I usually give them a lot of scenarios and get them to do role plays, right? And, even empathy, I start off with showing them pictures and asking to empathize with, you know, the people that they see in the pictures. And later on, when I actually tell them the story behind whose picture was actually shown, it's really nice to see the way they transform, because it also brings out prejudice, right? You know, the way you would have thought someone is, like, you know, when you see somebody and when they realize who the person actually is. So it's a lot of that, and scenarios, live scenarios, which usually happen in schools, like between students and teachers, between students and parents and teachers, you know, the principal or whoever is involved, like the management of the school. So a lot of scenarios, real life, where empathy is needed. And so through experiential discussions and, you know, through a lot of activities is how they learn each and every one of the concepts. And prejudice is something that I focus on a lot, because I think it all starts there, clearing out, you know, identifying our own assumptions and biases, and then working on it is extremely important if you really want to do empathy. And lately I've been focusing a lot on self-empathy as well, right? Because without empathizing with yourself, it's kind of really difficult to empathize with others. So yeah.
So I want to ask one more question about the educational space, and then we can move into the corporate space. But so I completely understand why teachers and then students, by virtue of the teacher training, you know, you can unpack some inherent biases and look at that. Why do you feel, and this is sort of like at the fundamental core nature of the work you're doing, why do you feel that that's important? Why should children develop the capacity to empathize?
They are the future of tomorrow. Like today's or tomorrow's future, they're being raised in homes and schools today. And it's extremely important that they practice empathy, they learn the skill, and they kind of see the world through empathy. There's a lot of polarization around these days. There's a lot of, difficulties around which I feel empathy can very powerfully eradicate. And that's something I've learned through my experience as well. Like every time I take an empathy session, I feel it just makes me a better person, like at least by a small margin. You know, you just get better when you're doing this sort of work. And children, research has shown, I mean, and it's clear, like research is very clear on how much children can improve, like when they are brought up through empathy. I mean, the Roots of Empathy program that Mary Gordon kind of started, it shows clearly how much of a change kids who underwent the program could have, right, by the end of it. So I would feel that. And teachers, I feel when they teach or when they understand the perspective of their students and then teach, the impact they can have is really, really huge. I mean, teaching, I feel, is one of the most important, one of the most powerful, professions ever, because everybody goes through education. Everybody, like teachers are the ones who make presidents, they are the ones who make politicians, even doctors, like any great professional for that matter. And which is why I feel they have a very powerful role. And teaching is not a job that is to be taken lightly. I mean, you're building generations, influencing generations of kids, right? So that's one space where I feel empathy is extremely important. Yeah.
Oh, I totally relate to everything you're saying. Yeah. Yes. So if we transition to a little bit to talk about the corporate sector, those are mostly adults that have fully formed ideas about the world and perspectives about the world, and may have a degree of resistance to, doing some empathy work with colleagues, because I would imagine it requires a degree of self-reflection and vulnerability to do that work. So could you walk us through sort of some of what you are witnessing through teams at companies doing this work and the benefits and the upsides of it?
Yeah. So, very often what I've seen from my practice is that workshops go well. People do, when they actually are very clearly given an idea about what empathy is and its benefits, that itself is enough for them to kind of, relate to it and understand its importance. But I have faced situations where people are like, no, I don't want to empathize. I mean, there is this area, like, I think towards the third day of my 3-day workshop, where we go into adversarial empathy, where, you take baby steps where you first empathize with people who are close to you, and then you move to, home, and then work. And then finally, when you come to people whom you don't really like, or people who, who at some point in life has really hurt you, and then, asking people to empathize with them, that's where sometimes I face a bit of a difficulty. I've had instances where once there was a teacher who was very clear. I mean, I just don't want to empathize with this person. They hurt me, right? And what I've seen is over here again, connecting these concepts very, very much to their, own life experience, right? And not just theirs. Usually when it's a group, the group within, if it's a 3-day workshop or it's a workshop that goes on for a longer period, then what happens is the group forms a deep bond with each other, right? They become very vulnerable. People are sharing their very deep personal experiences, and they become this very close-knit family kind of, a group. And then what happens is one person shares a story. Where, for example, once I was in a school in Ranchi, like in North India, and one of the girls, she volunteered. She wanted to speak about, so I give them an exercise sometimes, like think about one situation where somebody has very deeply hurt you. And then I encourage them to slowly step into the shoes of that person who hurt them, and probably let's kind of have a discussion around it. And there was this girl who started talking about her father. And she said, like, there's no way I can empathize with him. I hate him because, he's an alcoholic, and he beats up my mom. He beats me up, and, it's been a mess. My life has been a mess, and all kinds of problems. And but through discussion, what I started noticing is, when I started asking questions like, have you ever thought of why your father is probably behaving the way he is? Have you ever asked him how he's doing, how he's feeling? Like whether he's sad, whether he's bitter, like, just, and some of the questions somehow resonated. And I remember after a point, she broke down, and it was a very emotional kind of a situation. And she was talking about how she understands how important it is to kind of empathize and probably think from his perspective as well. And in fact, she went home that day promising to sit down and have a conversation with her dad, where she's going to focus completely on her dad's feelings and needs, and get an understanding of it, and then probably work things for the better. So I've seen both, right? And when these kind of experiences take place in a workshop, that is enough to convince some of the others over there who are resistant to kind of, jump in. And so that's what I've seen. Wherever there is resistance, the other participants and their experiences kind of change, the ones who are resistant.
Yeah, I found from my own teaching practice, in both of my classes that I teach a leadership class and I teach a social entrepreneurship class. And there's always one class devoted to storytelling. So in my social entrepreneurship class, we use a practice from Marshall Gantz, who teaches at the Kennedy School, called the public narrative. So it's got a particular architecture of storytelling. And then in my leadership class, it's a little bit more loose, where they learn some skills of storytelling, but as an art, as a leadership skill. How do you storytell to engage people? And what ends up happening is, you've got a bunch of students, 30 or 40 students, and now it's all on Zoom. So there's even like a degree of formality that's embedded in sort of the medium. But you've got students that have impressions about each other based on, whatever they look like and how they dress and how they comport and how they engage. And then through the simple act of storytelling, it's amazing how the facades come down. And in a 2 or 3 minute story, everybody's personality shines. And what I've noticed is that every student sort of steps up into this courageous, brave, and safe space to share a little bit about themselves. And I almost feel like through the culture that we live in, even though we're completely networked and exposed on social media, and confident speaking up, there's a sincere hunger to show up on a more authentic level and sort of expose yourself. This is who I am in a non-judgment space. And there's just a real desire for a sense of belonging. You've noticed that too?
Yeah, definitely. And what I do is I begin with, I always ask them to introduce themselves in a way that's very personal. Like, share your story, like tell us things that nobody knows about you. And so what happens is right from the introduction session, when people start up, and I always begin with myself, I start off in a very personal way. I tell them things about myself in a very personal way. And I've always felt that when facilitators themselves are vulnerable and authentic, that kind of encourages the others to do the same as well. And so I start off, and then I've seen every other person, right from the introduction, when you get people to become, very, very honest and vulnerable and, very personal, that builds the group into a very, the cohesion just, is there. And they become very close-knit. And then itself, they know, okay. And also, it's very important to kind of let them know that this is a very non-judgmental place, probably talk about confidentiality a bit, because whatever is discussed here today is going to stay within the group kind of a thing. And I also encourage, usually, if it's a session for students, I ask teachers to stay away, because, students, they tend to open up more when, people, anybody of authority is not around, right? Similarly, in corporate, workshops, if managers are away and it's just, the team, then they tend to open up a lot better. So, I've seen the same thing. Yeah.
I'm sensing that your feeling about empathy, it's sort of a gateway, not only to a more fulfilling life, but also at a more macro level to a more beautiful world. So when I think about the power of empathy, I think about, if we can leverage empathy through purpose, right? I call it purposeful empathy. We could challenge the status quo of how our world and how our systems operate, right? We could have a more just and sustainable and equitable world. So I think that there's a political part to purposeful empathy, but I also believe that there's a deeply spiritual part to and potential of empathy. Could you just speak to that for a second?
For sure. And I would say that spiritual part of it begins with self-empathy, right? I mean, it all begins there. So even coming back to the certification program as well, I'll kind of club that as well into this. So even in the certification program, it begins with, so what I plan to do is I plan to send some study material first, right? There are 6 modules. So the first module will reach you today. And then next week, we are going to regroup into, for a half-day session, live session. And by that time, this, along with the study material, there'll also be some parts to it where some reflection questions will be given. So you come prepared with some experiences from your life to the discussions, right? And that's what we discuss. And it's again going to be one of those very personal and very, experiential sort of discussions. And which is why I plan to take only 5 to 6 members per batch, right? Very small, because I believe in I believe that's important. Smaller the group, deeper the impact, and the cohesion, right? So, so then what happens is they go back and there'll be some activity. So whatever actionable items they kind of come out, with at the end of the half day session, they're going to go and implement it. So that is going to be the homework, right? There will be some very actionable, tiny bits which they can go back and implement in their day-to-day life, and through probably for the next 1 week, they'll have to take down notes on what exactly they're doing and then come back. So it's going to be that cycle. And there are 6 modules like that, and out of which 2 of them are on self-empathy. That's where we begin, right? 2 of the modules. So I would say almost, 4 weeks are dedicated just to self-empathy, because that's how important it is, right? So the spiritual aspect of it, I would say, begins with going into yourself, right? Observing like your thoughts, loving your thoughts. I mean, noticing what are the judgments that you make of yourself, right? It all begins there. And then once you gain an understanding of that, then it becomes much more easier to, every time you see a person, to empathize with them. And instead of projecting your feelings or projecting the negativities that lie inside you, instead you'd actually look for the good. If you're able to forgive yourself, make peace with yourself, then it'll be easier for you to forgive others and to make peace with others, right? And one thing that, has helped me a lot is the realization that at the end of the day, what we are is basically a mix of, I would say, nature and nurture. It's genes and the environment, right? These together make us what we are. And in the limit, and then we make choices, within the limits of this nature and nurture. That's how I believe or see, like, us people as. And then, if somebody else that you really hate, or someone, it can even be a politician that you kind of like, don't really like. If we were put in their place, right? If we had the same set of genes, and if we grew up in the same sort of environment, what guarantee do we have that we would turn out different? We would probably be exactly as they are, or probably even worse, right? You never know. So that realization always makes it easier for me to love people, like everybody that I see around. Like, sometimes there are people I genuinely do not agree with, and do not really enjoy being around. But at the end of the day, looking at the humanizing, right? Just looking at them as human beings with feelings and with dreams and with a story, that makes it a lot more easier. And one thing I always stress on is that it is possible to really empathize with one person without agreeing to them. In the sense, these are 2 very different things. Agreeing to somebody's opinion and empathizing with them, they're very different. I think a lot of people think that, by empathizing with somebody I don't like, or, someone who has hurt me, then I'm agreeing to them. It's like I'm saying that they are right, but that's not the case. So there needs to be a clear understanding of that, right? You can really dislike a person's opinion, dislike a person's behavior or actions, and yet empathize with them, like really think from their perspective. So yeah, I think all this is part of, I would say it's all a part of being spiritual, right? At the end of it, all these add to the spiritual values that you have.
Well, I'm hearing certainly that this work is healing. And I hear you use the word love, and it's very powerful to imagine that you could love everyone and have empathy for everyone in the world. So as a final thought, in a best case scenario, the work of empathy scales across a couple of generations. What would the world look like in your mind?
Oh, wow. It would look awesome. It would be a beautiful place to live. For me, it's been one of the biggest issues that eat me up almost on a daily basis. When I open the news, it is the polarization that there is. And one thing I keep stressing on everybody I speak to who's in the empathy space, who works in the empathy space, I always, like, especially to my advisors, Ledavai and Catherine, I always tell them how we all should just get together and do something to build empathy in the online space, because these days that is where people spend most of their time. But the kind of videos and the kind of comments and, you know, the way people treat each other sometimes online, it's so sad and it's so difficult. It becomes painful sometimes, right? And I know this is a very difficult topic and I usually don't bring it up, but religious polarization is one thing that kind of like really hurts. You know, it cuts through deep. I mean, and racism, these are all things that, you know, they must, you know, be slowly, like, you know, taken out of the system that we live in. And I feel all of us have a responsibility to do that. And while the social media has improved our lives in a lot of ways, it has also somehow, you know, added to the polarization and to the, you know, to the hatred as well. So, yeah, it's a dream to have a world like the one you talk about, where there is empathy being practiced for everybody. There's no hatred and there's only love. And it is possible. That's what I feel. It is a world that is a possibility, but it's just that each and every one of us has got to intentionally and mindfully, right, practice, you know, empathy and compassion and these sort of things. And I think it all begins right from kids, right? So parenting, education, these are all extremely important, and it all needs to begin there within a home, and then schools, and then corporates. Yeah.
Thank you so much for spending part of your evening with me and our viewers to share what you're doing with the Empathy University. And I'm really touched, and I wish you the best and best of luck.
Thank you so much, Anita. It's a pleasure, and I'm so glad I got this opportunity to talk to you. We'll be in touch.
We'll be in touch.